As Mayor of Derry City and Strabane District Council, it's my honour and privilege to be able to host the first of the John and Pat Hume Foundation events that we have here in the city. I think everyone will agree that John and Pat, throughout all of their life, struggled to bring peace to this part of our island, and we have moved on quite significantly over the last 20 years. We still need to fight and struggle for reconciliation, and I think that that's a job that the foundation will do in the name of John and Pat Hume. So I think we're in for a very interesting debate and a very interesting discussion over the next number of hours, and I'm looking forward to listening to it. But for me as Mayor, it is truly an honour and privilege to be able to open this first event in the name of John and Pat Hume.
Hi, my name's Sara Canning, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to a shared home place, the unfinished business of reconciliation. We've got a great panel here together tonight in Derry. We have Maureen Hetherington, who is the Director of The Junction, a community and peace building centre in Derry, Londonderry. She coordinates ethical and shared remembering with Johnson McMaster and the liberation from patriarchy with Cathy Higgins. Maureen is a previous recipient of the Community Relations Council's Exceptional Achievement Award. We've also got Seamus Farrell. Seamus has spent 25 years in overseas development work in various African countries. He had spent 10 years developing conflict resolution skills training programs for Northern Irish schools, and is involved in addressing pluralism, multiculturalism, racism and conflict with the School of Education at the University of Ulster. He's also a member of the Board of Directors of Children in Crossfire, and currently works at The Junction with Maureen as a trainer in ethical and shared remembering. We have Helen Henderson. Having spent most of her working life in the third sector, Helen Henderson has a background in global education, community development and peace building. Helen managed a peace centre based in Derry, Londonderry, St Colm's Park House, developing programmes promoting non-violent activism, participative democracy and compassionate leadership. Helen has just been appointed as one of the commissioners with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. She's not representing them on the panel. And previously she coordinated the development education work at Children in Crossfire, collaborating with educators in global justice and active citizenship. She is constantly inspired by ordinary people who make an extraordinary difference in our world. So now I'm going to introduce Maureen Hetherington, who's going to speak to us about a shared home place and the unfinished business of reconciliation.
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, I'd like to thank the Hume Foundation for inviting me here to speak. And I'd like to acknowledge the excellent paper at the last session presented by Dimpna McGlade, and the equally excellent responses by Duncan Morrow and Eileen Weir. It was very comprehensive, and I don't want to repeat what has already been said, but it certainly will influence what I have to say tonight, and influence my input. Dimpna's metaphor of a society transitioning to peace, going round and round in circles with one foot pinned to the floor because of the absence of political leadership of the peace process, is worth repeating. Duncan Morrow spoke of the need for doing something differently than we have always done before. He also talked about everything in society needing to be looked at, and he asked, what are we trying to create, which involves everybody, and acknowledging that there is need to look at the bigger picture. Eileen has always thought outside the box. Her work has been inclusive across all communities and faiths. Eileen stressed the powerful role of peace building by women long before the Good Friday Agreement. They, she said, and not politicians, have led the way in effecting change on the ground. Damien Gorman, poet and playwright, who has spent his life engaged with community and community relations issues, has just brought out a book through The Junction entitled As If I Cared, Poems and Other Parts of a Life. Damien explains the meaning behind the title. He says, why is it called As If I Cared? Because, he says, that's the way I move forward. My writing, my vision, my demeanour, they're all better than me. So I try to be prophetic of whatever bit of good I might do, throw the idea of it out there somewhere in front of myself, and attempt to grow into it. So, as community relations practitioners and peace builders, our job is to vision, to build a united community. So how do we go about that? How do we throw the idea of a united community out there in front of us And how do we, as a society, then attempt to grow into it? Stormont's efforts in together building a united community strategy and action plan has been doomed to fail from the get-go. Given the design of the political setup, our politicians cannot do united. It's anathema to them. The Good Friday Agreement took the existing political system as a given, even when it went against the core of reconciliation. It's a system which, however unintentionally, has, to quote Duncan Morrow, institutionalised sectarianism. And I want to emphasise this is not to be derogatory of politicians, but it's within a political system that they work. The inadequacy of the representative democracy system is a global as well as a local problem. The built-in sectarianism that overlays it in Northern Ireland contains within it a warning to voters that if they don't vote as usual along sectarian lines, they're effectively advantaging or voting for the other crowd. This constitutes an enormous pressure out of fear and mistrust to vote to block the other rather than take decisions that best serve everyone. This is further exacerbated by the behaviour of some politicians and their rhetoric. The lack of accountability within the system adds to the deep mistrust and frustration. Conflict and violence are difficult to overcome. There is no situation globally where justice has been done by means of conflict. This is a messiness and consequence of violence. Our politicians need victimhood in order to stay in power. Party politics closes down the potential for doing things differently. How many times do we need to consult, draw up reports, talk and deliberate on the same issues without getting a different, more satisfactory outcome? There is no potential for a vision of the common good because of party politics. We need to find another model of politics. If society can get a vision of the future, then the vision of how politics can work will hopefully emerge. The Hume Foundation, in partnership with all who strive for real peace, has an opportunity to do something differently, to throw out a new vision, a new way of doing things. As a consequence of a world pandemic, we now have to look at reconciliation differently and do things differently. Everything has changed utterly. No longer can we be insular in our thinking about our place here or in the world. We need a global vision. Globalization takes many different forms. The globalization we're familiar with is neoliberalist. It is destructive of humanity and of the earth. But there is an alternative, a global system that is ethical and compassionate, that following the Africa concept of Ubuntu, locates individual identity in the context of belonging to each other. It enables human flourishing and a future for life on earth. Ubuntu is the removal of self-serving practices. So where to begin? The answer is simple. It starts with us, with addressing the enormous gaps between the haves and the have-nots and the inequalities exposed by COVID-19. And this is not as difficult as it seems. It has been heartening to see the incredible resourcefulness and generosity of thousands of people on the ground, truly bringing a deep and profound meaning to being all in this together. Individuals and groups across the community and voluntary sector have been providing much needed support and love to the most vulnerable and those in need, irrespective of political, religious or cultural backgrounds. There are important lessons to be learnt from this devastating pandemic. For the world at large and in our wee part of the world here, everyone and everything is connected and interdependent. And what we believe, what we say, how we act can have powerful consequences, good and bad. And how we choose to use our power is up to each and every one of us. Under the terms of the New Decade, New Approach deal in January 2020, the following are requirements of the Executive under the heading Civic Engagement. to reform the existing civic advisory panel, which will propose a model of civic engagement for specific issues, including one citizens' assembly a year. And 1 or 2 issues per year will be identified by the executive for civic engagement. It would seem that the concept of a citizens' assembly remains largely unknown in the public discourse. Suffice here to say that it is a mechanism whereby a group that is truly representative of the wider society is assembled and charged with the task of coming to a determination on a substantive issue affecting the society. The jurisdiction's legislator is required to consider the Assembly's findings and recommendations and either implement them or provide reasons for not so doing. This requirement, indeed mandate, for extended civic engagement and specifically for citizens' assemblies provides a pathway out of the logjam on substantive issues that the existing political system has proved incapable of dealing with. The plethora of legacy issues are glaring examples. Personally, my work at the grassroots community level leaves me convinced that the goodwill and common sense that is needed to address such issues is present in civic society in spades. However, dealing with the past that is still recent and raw may be a task that is beyond our generation to complete. It might be useful to reflect on the insights of the late Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi, who, on talking to survivors of the Holocaust, picked up that most of the Holocaust survivors did not talk or deal with the past. Rather, they set about building a future. They set about building a better life for their children and their grandchildren. Only when they had done so did they begin to engage fully with the past. The concluding words of Damien Gorman's recent drama about the legacy of the Troubles, Anything Can Happen, questions the wisdom of dwelling exclusively in the past. You can't cry forever, like you can't hold your breath forever, even if you wanted to, even if you tried your best. Your own lungs would fight you for dear life, and they would win. It is the future that matters. So it is questions such as these that need addressed now. What sort of world do we want our children and our children's children to live in, say, 2050? What new economic systems are needed? What will be the role of America, China, and India in a world where the centre of gravity in relation to power is visibly shifting? What will be the position of Europe by then? And what will be Ireland's place in that world of 2050? This is a bigger picture that Duncan talked about and Eileen talked about. The bigger context. As my colleague Seamus Farrell would say, we are but passengers on spaceship Earth. Local issues such as the constitutional question and the shared island and civic unionism discourses needing attention must be contextualised in the global. So what does reconciliation look like within this larger context? Can we do things differently? Reconciliation is relational and it's about social relationships, not at an individual level or between a few people. It is concerned with social, relational communities. Johnston McMaster talks about integrated reconciliation, consisting of 6 strands. The word socio is important alongside the themes to emphasise our social, relational, communal realities. They are, and this is in no particular order, socio-political. The Belfast Agreement was about the totality of relationships, and there is a need now for a new commitment to relationships between the North and South, East and West. Relationships will be crucial post-Brexit, or our political system will fall apart. Socio-economic. Unless there is a fair, just economic system in place, reconciliation is going to elude us. It is integral to reconciliation. The big mistake that came out of post-World War I at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, through financial penalties imposed by victors and by not addressing the economics, resulted in a failed peace and created the conditions for the rise of racism and fascism and communism and led to World War II. When poverty is endemic, if poverty and hopelessness is not addressed, then the conditions for future conflict and violence are created. Socio-legal. Reconciliation always needs to bring about legal reform. A more just legal system is required, and core to that is human rights legislation. In our society, North and South, and in British society, there are no human rights bills, and that may become an issue post-Brexit for people in Britain and here. Over 50% of the population in Northern Ireland have European passports and will remain European citizens. And where will they stand in the European Court of Human Rights and the global human rights legislation? Socio-environmental. Reconciliation includes relationships with nature. We need to address issues of climate change. How well do we do in relation to various protocols and agreements? Paris and Kyoto agreements to bring down our carbon emissions, for example. What do we do with waste? It's part of reconciliation, but we're not thinking about or discussing these issues widely enough. Instead, we're caught up in a past that does not address huge issues coming down the track. If our politicians cannot work together now, what does the future hold for us on every important issue that will impact and potentially destroy lives, livelihoods in our generation and in future generations? Socio-psychological. Who we are and where we belong. Identity politics need to be taken out of a parochial context. There are multiple identities, and we need to move away from binary terms which are not a reality in our lives today. A large percentage of the population do not see their identity tied up in such binary terms. We have multiple, complex identities, including gender identities. We need to break out of binary thinking if we are future-oriented. Can we be more global in our thinking? Can we have shared identities? The big myth at the heart of the UK out of Brexit negotiations is that they are fixated on absolute sovereignty, which does not actually exist and will exist less after COVID-19. We're only getting vaccines, for example, because the world collaborated. Last but not least is socio-spiritual. We always need to clarify what this does not mean. It doesn't mean religiosity or institutional forms of religion. Spirituality is to do with purpose, meaning, and values. What are the values and ethics that need to be at the heart of reconciliation now and into the future? And how will they shape 2050? So how do we as a society build neighbourliness? A tenacious solidarity that is relational? And worth mentioning again, this has been evidenced throughout the pandemic, where communities have set aside their differences and worked across all community sectors to support the vulnerable, sick and needy. Leo Varadkar, former Taoiseach, talked about the need for a new covenant. Can we enter into a covenant of neighbourliness with each other for the sake of the common good, for the achievement of lasting peace that will need all of the strands of reconciliation that I have mentioned above? So where are we right now? I suggest that under our current system of power and government, we are skirting about the edges. We are walking around the houses. In her paper to Session 1, Dimpna wondered if it's not that we are stuck with both feet nailed to the floor. In order to bring about a reconciled and united community, we need to be looking at structural and systemic changes at the heart of government. But we can begin with the empowerment of civic society by bringing about participative and deliberative democracy. So may I conclude, as did Dimpna McGlade in Session 1, with this quote from John Hume. The real duty now, if we want to have a totally peaceful and stable country, is for all true democrats to implement the will of the people. Thank you.
was fantastic, Maureen. Some really interesting points raised and some really interesting talking points, I think. One of the things that I really picked up on was you were talking about how we are in a society where it's merely portrayed that if you don't vote along party lines, you're encouraging the other side and you're putting your vote towards them. How do we encourage people to vote in their best interests as opposed to along tribal lines or along the best interests of the maybe wider nationalist or wider unionist community? How do we encourage that? And do you feel that a citizens' assembly would help that?
We experienced a lot of people in the workshops over the last couple of years. We worked with hundreds in different situations and different settings, Sarah. And it was interesting because people were very frustrated with the politics, and many of them would have said, I don't want to vote for the party that I've always voted for. I'm frustrated, but who do I vote for? And it was this fear to keep the others out, and it always came back to them. And it is a difficult situation, so I think that the citizens' assemblies are amazing mechanisms that you can create the conditions for a wide and diverse range of people to come together to think differently. But it is a matter of time to get people to build up the confidence to think about community politics rather than party politics. And that trust needs to be built, and to say to people over and over again, we have to think of the bigger picture for the future, because we always talk about the future is our children, but we're not doing enough for them.
Yeah. How do we get the whole of society behind peace building? We're still quite afraid to have the conversations. We shy away from it a lot of the time. We're afraid to offend, we're afraid to get angry, to show emotion. How do we involve people in that and make it more accessible?
Well, I think for me, it was interesting. I had to interview somebody very recently, and they said, look, I'm fed up hearing the same diatribe all the time in the same language. But he actually had gone into a project because it was language differently. It was more upbeat and uplifting. I do think that the 6 strands of reconciliation is a way in for young people, for example, young people who care about the environment. And I think it's important that they realise that there is a bigger context of reconciliation and that we have to engage people in all those different conversations, because we can build a united community in different ways. And then the politics starts to fall away as we start to engage as relational human beings and get to know each other on a different level. So I think that that's why it was important for me to put the 6 strands of reconciliation out there. I mean, as a community relations practitioner, certainly I won't be dealing with them or focusing on them, but I do think that in the bigger context, it's an opportunity to think differently about our future.
So Seamus, you have spent a number of years working in conflict resolution in various countries around the world. Do you feel that there are things from Northern Ireland that you've drawn on for that, and are there things that you could bring back?
Certainly the experience that I had, thanks Sarah, the experience that I had working in different conflict, whether ethnic conflict situations or conflict brought about by poverty, the scramble for resources and so on. I think I value them now for what they taught me about how to do peace building here. Yes, we're all in the one place. There is a commonality, but there's a wisdom around the world in managing conflict, which we have been able to bring to here. And I hope maybe Northern Ireland has been able to say something to the wider world as well. Maureen, thanks for how you connected this session with the previous one, which I think is important. Dimpna, with the help of Duncan and Eileen, focused very much on the state we're in, the reality, the messy realities of now. I think what you have done then is to progress that in light of what Dimpna in particular spoke about the need to think future and think globally. We can be caught up in our messy reality to the point of first of all, to the point of forgetting about the fact that we don't live in a bubble, isolated from all that's going on in the rest of the world, not being influenced as if, because that's not the case at all. The other thing that struck me as you were talking was how we have in the community activist peace building world been tragically, as Dipna mentioned, stuck in the past. Now, I'm not giving away any secrets when I say that Dipna laid the blame fairly and squarely fundamentally on our political system, as you have done as well. And you mentioned the abject, I call it abject failure to deal with the legacy of the past. That has been horrendous for victims of the conflict. But I've been thinking recently that it has done terrible damage to the work of the future, of building future, because it has locked all of us into trying to deal with a fundamental deficit which was mandated to them and which they have failed to do. The consequence of that is that we are absorbed too much in dealing with the past. Now, and I want to stress here, the needs of victims are critical, and it is the failure of government to deal with them adequately that is the problem. But if you could imagine a situation in which politics had stepped up to the plate and taken its responsibility, what would we in the reconciliation peace building business to be doing? I think we'd be doing exactly what Maureen has spoken about, and that is thinking future, because it is the future that matters. The past doesn't. The past drags us down. The past must be dealt with, but the future is what matters. And hence the kind of questions that Maureen was asking, what kind of future do we want to create for our children? COVID, as all of us have noticed, doesn't do boundaries, doesn't ask permission. And I think that's a lesson for humanity, that we belong together. That means that even though we must deal with our local messy issues, we cannot deal with them if we are not taking account of the wider global context. The shift in the centre of gravity to India and China, the implications of that. The implications for us in terms of Europe around whether Scotland might go for independence. If it does, it is raising a big, big question for us here who live on this island. So we cannot be talking about our local stuff only. We need to be taking account of what's coming in at us from elsewhere. So I like the connection between session one, this was the reality, what do we need to do? So Maureen, thanks. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Helen, have you got anything to add?
Yep, and again, thanks to Maureen for covering a lot of ground, and I really I solidly agree with a lot of the points that you made. And you know, one of the areas that was really refreshing to see with the Hume Foundation was the language of non-violence, and I think maybe that's something that's been missing in good relations. And for me, I suppose, feeling slightly frustrated working in good relations over the years of the language and the need to move it beyond the practice of non-violence as a practice of peace. You know, so good relations in itself as a concept is probably something that has served its time. And maybe this is the step of the transition for peace work to really step into the courageous non-violent action. And I suppose non-violence is very much about what Seamus and Maureen has talked about, creating the conditions for dialogue, for safe dialogue, to explore these really contentious issues. But it's also the resisting the injustices as well. It's also that resistance, which takes courage and comes with repercussions of punishment, and whether, and I think that's something that makes it really difficult. But it's and I think that non-violence as a practice, as a way of life. So somebody once said to me, this is about the practice of peace 2 meters away from you, and I think that really struck with me. I thought, so this may be, on that very basic level. Now we've the 2 meters social distance, and it's still relevant. But that practice of peace is a daily practice. And I think that idea of living well together, looking towards the future, how do we live well together, and how is wellness and well-being in that more holistic sense of being at peace with myself and peace with others, and also at peace with the natural world in which we're dependent on all the time. So that's very much something I've been interested in, and it was so refreshing to hear it and Maureen's talk, because sometimes it's not something you hear within the good relations sector. So I think this is really, I was so excited to hear about the Hume Foundation and to hear the language that was being used, to think, is this us transitioning to a more courageous way of doing this work? So, yeah, thanks.
And another thing would just be, how do you envisage that we would support the next generation of peace builders? There's so many of these kids out here who have maybe have been born post Good Friday Agreement, and their experiences of the conflict are very limited. They're either passed down, or it's what they see on TV, or they're being indoctrinated by people who have other aims, basically. How do we support them to steer away from that, and how do we show them the process of peace that we've all envisaged for the last 21 years?
Eileen Weir actually addressed that in her talk whenever she responded to Dimpna, and she said, what about the next generation of young people? They're not coming along to do this work, and the older generation, she herself said she had so much expertise to pass on, and everything was in her head, and how was she going to pass that on? She did talk about being serious, a seriousness taken of the community sector and the work that it does, and that funding has to be revisited with long-term serious funding. I think that if young people had the opportunity to go into careers that look at this, peace building as a serious subject matter that they could actually make a career of and become very much part of in the community sector, that they might think about taking it up. But it is difficult because there are a lot of people that are so disconnected now, and they're young people leaving the country because of unemployment. So how do we encourage young people to come back? And I'd like to go back to what I was saying about the larger, bigger strands of reconciliation, that if we can engage them in different ways, always with the idea of we are building something in this country that's going to be special and unique, and that we're going to have a better future for them all, they will stay, and maybe there will be more effort put into making society better for everybody. So
the issues that hit young people getting out of bed in the morning, are not the issues that we engage with. But they do, and for blooming good reasons, have an issues around the environment. They have issues around gender, huge issues, and in the context of COVID, they are facing a hugely challenging future where opportunity doesn't seem to be there, and where they are in many ways primarily the victims now, of that. So the idea that Maureen put up there of no longer having boundaries, this is peace work, this is environmental work, this is gender work, this is justice and human rights work. This is about the future. And we have an obligation to make connection with young people by starting to say, what are your issues? And enabling them to see that this relates to that global ethical community building that is, of which our bit at peace building is a part.
Helen?
I think Seamus hit the nail on the head in terms of, not seeing these things as being separate. It's interesting, human rights and good relations, and these sectors kind of worked very separately, and actually there's actually huge potential if there was a galvanizing that connected them. And I think in terms of young people, I think always, like, I worked in youth work for many years, and starting where they're at, you always start where they're at, and I think they have a different lens in terms of what they have grown up with, and I think their voice is really important, and I think their voice, back to what Maureen said about participation, a lot of young people don't feel they live in a democracy. They don't feel like they're listened to, they don't feel like their voice is valued. So I think there's a critical part in that. If they're not involved in creating that vision and that image, then they won't buy into it.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, a friend of mine said, you should never have a board meeting without a young person in the room. I remember thinking that was really good advice, because there's something, there's a clarity maybe, or their lenses aren't as dirty as ours as they get over the years, that is really important. And I don't see it. I don't see that level of participation in the corridors of power where young people's voices are being heard. So I think that's critical.
And one of the things that we've been wondering about was about how peace builders in local communities could become affiliated with the Hume Foundation, and how we could do that going forward. And there is definitely a place for young people. That's one of the things that I've felt from the start. Is there something you could see that we could make happen?
What can I say but that we cannot be working in our little silos doing it parallel to each other, unless there's joined up doing at the level of foundations, non-community and voluntary sector, community groups, community and voluntary sector agencies, peace building, unless there is that collaboration. An example of currently of wonderful collaborative practice on the environment, where the political parties and community agencies that are involved in specifically issues around the environment have achieved a wonderful thing of getting Stormont, a reluctant Stormont, to work on legislation for the environment. The current terms of the current assembly, it's 2021 or sometime not far away when the current term ends. Now, any legislation that is to get over the line before the end of that needs to be being done now. So an approach was made to the Minister of the Environment, Edwin Poots, to say, can you bring forward legislation which requires substantial work drawing up draft legislation? Can you start to work on it, because it's needed within 3 months in order to give time for it to be scrutinised and go through an assembly? Edwin, for his own reasons, declared the whole idea of 3 months to draft legislation as, quote, ridiculous. Not possible. The bureaucracy couldn't do the drafting of legislation in that short time. So a number of community and voluntary sector organisations, including ones locally based, Derry, Londonderry, got together, and with the help of academics, legal people, the community sector itself, journalists and so on, they came up with draft legislation. They borrowed from Scotland, Wales, from England, because actually Northern Ireland is the only one of the 4 nations in the UK that doesn't have legislation. It's another example of failure. They took that. It was well constructed, very carefully constructed, to make sure that people who wanted to knock it down wouldn't be able to. They took it to all the political parties. All the political parties identified themselves as sponsors of the programme, with the exception of DUP. And it therefore had the strength to be brought to the Speaker in Stormont, and he is now under obligation on the back of the political parties, stepping outside that sectarian framework that they're caught in and saying, we back this. And so it is now coming before Parliament and will be discussed and will hopefully get over the line before the end of this current Assembly. If we had been waiting for bureaucracy to do it, we'd be waiting forever. So I give that an example of where political parties, civic society say these things are too important, these things are more important than our sectional interests. This is about our common future.
One of the terms that was used is the shared home place, and I think there's something really special about that. And I think, recently some of the work that we've been trying to do is to connect people more to their place, whether you're from here or not, but that connection with place is really important. And I think here we have such a rich culture and such a rich landscape, and there's a beautiful word in Irish called duchas, and it means, it's a really special word because it's quite hard to translate, but it's really about that belonging to a place, and it encapsulates your tribe or your people, so your ancestors or the people that you came from, but also talks about the place, your place of origin, where you came from as well. And I think there's something I get really excited about, a kind of more regenerative way of doing peace work as embracing of our cultures and and I think our language of the land as well. And I was really inspired by Landa Irvine to start learning Irish, and I've been learning for a couple of years, and I know it's a really politicized area, but the language that was this ancient language, it holds so many like magical secrets of our land and our mythology and our stories, and I think there's something there about that reconnecting, that maybe the globalization and that this process that we've been through has disconnected us from our land and our stories and our myths. And whether I'm from a Protestant tradition or a Catholic tradition, or I'm a new family just arrived in the country a year ago, that it actually can really connect people. And I think for me, I just would love to do a bit of like Seamus Heaney's digging and dig a wee bit more and find out what are the treasures there that will bring us together and will restore us, and restore our environment. So that's an area I get really excited about. You should have guessed.
That's really lovely though. And we were talking about like globalism and about the fact that it has kind of disconnected us from our sense of self, and I suppose in one way it has done that, in another way we are very much stuck in our very Northern Irish bubble, and we're very unique, I think, in the world, in the way that we think of ourselves, in the way that we express ourselves. Looking at kind of spreading outside Northern Ireland and building on what we were talking about before, about the lessons that you've learned from other countries and the lessons you've learned from here. How would you envisage the foundation building a global consortium for peace building and reconciliation?
Well, I immediately think of John now. Okay, he had as his objective peace here, but in his reaching out, in his working at European level and transatlantic level and globally, I think he was including here and speaking to a wider world. So I think there's a model. We are at a time when barriers are going up, Brexit being part of it, but also, other places as well. And so the whole concept of nations working together and peoples working together and so on is going through a rough patch. We need to recover that concept. The European Union was born out of an awareness that it was critical if there was to be peace in Europe. Here we come back again. It was not set up as an economic operation. It was brought up on the back of the atrocities of the 20th century perpetrated within Europe, the so-called civilized part of the world, responsible for more uncivilized behavior than anywhere in human history. And the need for nations to share sovereignty, and so on. So anything that we can be doing at any level as foundation or collectively here, I think we ought to be paying attention to the need to contribute to the global discourse, which recognises that the primary identity is being human.
And I think that there are lessons to be learnt, and lessons to be shared. And you know, it's interesting that we have so many international delegations coming here to find out how we have brokered the peace, and we are still struggling to move on, you know, so many years later. And I think that there are examples to be learnt. And it is a progress, you know, it's very, very slow progression. Building peace is very slow. And I don't think that we can jump ahead of ourselves. You know, we've got to keep working at it. And as Damien Gorman would say, throw something out there and hope to grow into it. And always be thinking of the bigger picture, because we do get really parochial and caught up in we ourselves alone. That individualism, instead of, you know, being part of a community. The Ubuntu is a lovely example of, you know, that neighbourliness and thinking not within yourself, but rather as part of a union of people, and people coming together and looking after each other. So
I learned more about peace work in Ireland when I was doing global education. And it was actually, I went a very roundabout way. And I remember talking to Maureen about this, that I actually ended up doing global education around the world about, you know, global justice, the structural causes of poverty and inequality, and then came right back to this island and learned about, you know, the impact of colonialism and understanding that the Troubles didn't happen out of a bubble. And actually, for me, learning that whole pre-history was completely eye-opening. I had no idea. So I think through the global education and that global lens, it opened my eyes in a way that they hadn't been. And recently in February, I had the privilege of meeting lots of people from different First Nations from all over the world, and really, I suppose, listening and understanding where they were at and how, and their mental health model, for example, it had colonialism in it, you know, as and not with a point of blaming or keeping us stuck in the past, but it's really important we recognise that our mental health and our trauma now has been impacted by that. And it's not about a narrative of who was the perpetrators or not. And I thought that was really interesting, because I'd never seen it mentioned in a mental health context, never mind a peace context. So I think there's something there with our, you know, peoples around the world that have lots of wisdom. As Seamus says, that, you know, there's something so wise that whilst there's no PhDs in the room, there was a lot of wisdom, and maybe our world is seeing a shift back to this, like, you know, valuing that wisdom, you know, which it maybe hasn't been valued until now. So,
but I think I've been taught more by people who never darkened the door of a classroom in their lives. You know, the wisdom of lived experience, the wisdom of struggle to survive.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something we see here in Northern Ireland quite often in the older generations who didn't have the benefits that maybe their children had, but had so much lived experience. And I mean, I know my daddy left school at 11, but he was one of the smartest men I ever met.
Yeah, there you go.
You know?
Yeah, so Sarah, I think there's something really important in that comment, and that one of our biggest segregations in our society is age. You know, and it goes back to what Maureen said at the start about that, you know, the elders and the wisdom that are there in that generation, which, you know, the fear is we're going to lose a lot of those people and COVID, and but I think increasingly I'm drawn towards listening to our older generation and the wisdom that they have, and creating spaces for that for our young people is really important.
But I think also sometimes it comes across as if we're politician bashing all the time. You know, I could never be a politician. I couldn't do it. And so there's an admiration for the work that they have to do. And it's not a choice I would make, because it's very highly pressurized. But they are the products of their past. They have come through violence and conflict. They have lived their own lived experience, and they come with their baggage as well. So whenever they come to the table and whenever they're trying to make decisions, we have to appreciate that they have come with all their baggage. And that's very difficult to break out of whenever you're in a political system that has also got a natural institutionalized sectarianism built in. And you're always going to be fighting your corner from your perspective. And that can be difficult if you don't or can't see the wider, bigger picture. And I suppose for us in the work that we've been doing around the centenary, it has been very important that we have an understanding of the different interpretations of history and what has happened to us, that we accept that there's a complexity of the narratives that are out there, but we have to also accept that the multiplicity and the plurality of the stories, that we have to be generous and open to them. And that's very difficult for politicians, because they're representing a whole cohort of people that have built or that have voted them in particular, for particular reasons. So I think there has to be more understanding of the politicians who are also caught up in a political system, who are also caught up in what has been done to them and what has happened to them, and many of them have gone into politics for the very reasons of what has been happening to them in their past. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And I think when we look at trauma and the effect that trauma has, it probably does translate quite clearly in so many of our politicians who would be more conservative in their views, or aren't as conservative in their views, but usually just to combat the people who are conservative in their views.
And you're back to party politics, where you have to pull, you have to toe the party line, and then you might have very personal opinions and differences, but whenever you do go on public, but that's the whole system that makes it very, very difficult for people to step out of that. And it's back to those like binary terms where you're either this or that, but you can't be a multiple. And it's back to talking about multiple identities. We're more than just this or that in the binary terms.
And talking about that binary, especially the two tribes notion here, how invalid is that?
Exactly. I mean, especially as now we're moving on to a more multicultural Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And it's such an amazing thing to see.
But Seamus Heaney, talking about the home place, he liked to quote a poet, and I forget his name, from Armagh direction, a previous generation, who began one of his poems by saying, "We're a through other people." Now, I like the term, we're through other, because it's kind of a double meaning. But anybody who's done their DNA of late will discover the truth of that. We're all mixed up. And thence the binaries, whether in relation to gender or ethnicity or whatever, are without a real foundation in reality.
And I think also we can also call back to Helen's previous point about colonialism, because a lot of the binary systems that we have in place are as a result of colonialism. The tribes that existed before that binary notion didn't exist for them, or was very limited. So I mean, there is always kind of a throwback to the past, I suppose, in these systems.
Yeah, so a question I have is, imagine what a political system that was compassionate would look like. So imagine if we had, if we had compassion for our politicians, which is what Maureen was demonstrating, but also within how we did politics, that it could be compassionate, it could understand the opposing view or listen, and I just think that's a great, my imagination doesn't quite stretch that far, but but someday we might be able to imagine it.
And just in you saying that too, Helen, I think that we have to call the media to account. I think that the media has done so much damage and has helped to create the conditions where people are very fearful and mistrustful because of the way that things are reported, because of the language that is used, because of how they create farcical situations, and the truth has been bypassed totally. And I think that there has to be something about that honest brokering, that the media take on a different role, because they have created conditions for violence and conflict, and they have stoked the fire. And I think that the media have to think about being more ethical in the way that they do things as well. And it is always about pushing a story. So what's the next big story? And it's just unbelievable the amount of stuff that you read. And now I've got to the point, I don't believe anything I read in the papers. I've had to stop looking at the papers because I can't think about, well, what is the truth and what is fact, what is fiction, you know, and that's very sad to see, because young people too are addicted to the social media and the different social platforms, and that has created huge issues for young people mentally and their own mental health, and you know, and I think that all of those things in this world of now trying to reconcile ourselves to COVID-19, reconcile ourselves with a country that's going to go through huge changes. Everything has changed utterly. How do we look after them now? And then how do we build reconciliation? And I think that there are opportunities, given the COVID-19 and the pandemic, that we might start looking differently about how we move forward and look at all of those big issues in a more holistic way. You know, we're bigger than these tribal identities, and we've much more in common. But the media has a huge role to play.
Massive.
Yeah.
So we're here at the second session, discussing a shared home place and discussing peace building. How do you see us moving forward from here?
Whether in session one or in this session, I think we have kept coming back to the big cow on the line. You know, that's the obstacle, and it is a dysfunctional political system, which is not a criticism of politicians, but of a system which is not working. Now this, I think Maureen mentioned this is a global problem as well as a local problem, and that is that our system of democracy, what we call democracy, wherever we claim there is democracy in the world, could be defined as representative democracy. Every 4 or 5 years, the citizenry get to put forward people who will do politics for them until the next election. Now, it's turning up Bolsonaros and Trumps and Orbans and worse to come. I think what we are talking about is the big question where, yes, it could be said that representative democracy has functioned fairly well. In the new complex realities of our time, it ain't working. And I was interested to hear Helen saying there that a current engagement for her is around deliberative, participative engagement. A useful way to go, it's a suggestion anyway, that we begin to explore what do we mean by participative or deliberative democracy. The Good Friday Agreement built in a kind of a cosmetic civic forum, which everybody knew wouldn't work from the start because it wasn't participative. It was the great and the good elected or selected and not listened to, you know, it was. So we now have throughout the world a lot of thinking going on about how to deal with the dysfunctionalism of our political systems. And among them are models of citizen engagement, such as citizen assembly, which is not the only one, but it is being put forward as an example, but isn't much known about, I don't think, very much yet. And this really is about the fact that instead of just the politicians go forward to work for 4 or 5 years, that they go with their people. The people go with them. That people are invited to participate in the decision making and in the deliberations and in the coming to a determination about things. There's a big complaint that the citizenry aren't voting and aren't interested. They don't, because they don't see any point what's coming back for them. I'm absolutely convinced that if there was a genuine willingness on the part of the political establishment to have an engagement with civic society and a hands-on engagement where they are part of the deliberative process, I think you would find a citizenry that would fully be aware of how important it is that their voice is heard. You know, so.
Yeah, for me, you know, the Hume Foundation has the opportunity to do something differently, particularly in light of COVID-19 and this pandemic. In fact, all the political parties have an opportunity now to think differently about how they conduct themselves, because they've come through this huge pandemic and it has been hugely difficult for them, making very, very difficult decisions. So if I were the Hume Foundation, I would be asking the question, where will we be in 2050? Where will we be in 2070? Because we talk about we want a better future for our children and our children's children. And if we can think of problems that are solution focused, that if we start to think there, where they are in 2050 and work back from that. We want children who are living in an environmentally free landscape. We want children to have jobs and careers. We want the best for them in education. We want a reconciled community. Everybody in this together, everybody pulling together, everybody working together. So how do we get there? And then start working back from there, rather than being caught up in the past, but rather always future oriented and maybe getting a different conversation. What is that saying, where, you know, we do the same thing over and over and again in the hope that we have a different outcome. You know, maybe this is the opportunity where we ask different questions and help people then to think. You know, young people ask them, well, where do you want to be in 2050? I doubt I'll be around, but it would be nice that if we could put something down. I would just hate in the future for our children to look back maybe 100 years from now, back at this big decade, and say, you know, I would love them to say it was the wise people who did that, that changed the conversation, that helped us to think differently, and that made things better for them. Yeah.
I'm reminded of the phrase you like, we are history makers.
Yeah.
We're called to make history.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think in this current moment, if there was history needed to be made, this is the moment. So I think there's something about this existential crisis that we find ourselves in, where many species are at risk of going extinct, including the human species. And so for the first time, we've had to face this reality that in 50 years' time, there may not be any human species left. And I think, and not for that to be engendering fear, but more about how do we now, this is the moment, and we only have a very short moment to actually turn this around. And very often in a crisis comes change, and sometimes it takes a crisis, and sometimes our hand needs to be forced, and that's essentially what is happening. Our hand will be forced, and I think the opportunity for the Hume Foundation is huge, because there's a gravitas there, there's a moral power and authority that people will listen to, and that can access the vertical, you know, can work its way up the food chain to where decisions are being made. And I think that's perhaps a frustration that we felt within the sector that we work in, a community sector that's been cut to the bone, that isn't valued, and our voice isn't always heard. So I think there's maybe a hope there that those courageous words can come from the likes of the Hume Foundation to guide not just the peace sector. I think the peace sector is in transition and it's a really important transition where it goes, but also the political system, as our systems collapse around us. Where can we see the glimmers of light of a new system that can build back better and actually be a better that we all want to be part of? So I think that's exciting.
Definitely. Well, thank you to Helen and to Seamus, and a special thank you to Maureen for presenting their paper. I think it gave us a lot to think about and talk about tonight. And if you would like to find out more about the Hume Foundation, you can find out about it at humefoundation.org.